Good morning, committee. Welcome to Federal and State Affairs. Everybody's got their own seating chart, so you're in your new seats. I would mention that our ranking member will not be here for a few days. He has had COVID, and so he's quarantined until next week. We talked yesterday, and I assured him we would not work anything until he's back. Also, Representative Hauser is also homesick. Roderick, right there, close to me. Yeah. But Representative Hauser has had COVID, and apparently he's had a really bad case of it. He's having a rough time, but hopefully he may come back next week also, but there's no guarantee. That's what he told me. So I would suggest you keep them all in your prayers, and hopefully we don't lose any other members, but we kind of expect that this year. With that, I will do bill introductions from committee. The chair has one, and this comes out of the modernization, the interim committee on modernization of alcohol. It's RS 2715. It allows private clubs to buy their liquor from any retail store in the state. Without objection, it's admitted. Other bill introductions from committee. Seeing no bill introductions from committee, is there bill introductions from the audience? Please come forward, identify yourself, and you must have an RS number. If you'll hit the mic.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. My name is Bob Corkins with Frontier Peace. I'm here to request introduction of RS 2473, which is known as the Defend the Guard bill. It would prevent our Guard units from being deployed to active combat overseas unless Congress has formally declared war, and it would give Guardsmen the right to decline the COVID vaccine without any disciplinary action.
Thank you. Without objection, it's accepted. Thank you. Other bill introductions from the audience? Seeing none. I'm going to go to our WebEx technician. Could you inform us of who is on WebEx?
Yes, Mr. Chair. We have Connie, well, she's right there. We have Craig Jones, Louis Ruiz, and Michelle.
Thank you. Representative Louise, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here watching you all on WebEx. So stay healthy and good luck. All
right. Well, we wish you a speedy return. I keep looking to my right, and you're not there. So I'll have to look at the screen today to see you. But with that, committee, we have just a couple of announcements. We're going to be hearing a bill today. We will be meeting again tomorrow, Thursday. Today is Wednesday. I will have an agenda out today by 1 o'clock for next week. We will be setting some bills for hearings. Also, there is, as to Senate Bill 81, which we're hearing today, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, if you wish to see a demonstration on what a safety inspection entails on an elevator, it will be available at 8 o'clock down in the room right past security. And there'll be someone down there they're going to give you breakfast if you care to eat, but you can also see what an inspection entails on an elevator. With that, I will call up Senate Bill 181 and ask the reviser. Yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill is a Senate bill passed the Senate 32-7. What it does is it establishes the Elevator Safety Act And I'll just run through the sections of the bill very quickly. You've got a very detailed supplemental note and so on. The section 2 is a definition section. There's a definition of elevator, means any device for lifting or moving people, cargo, freight within, and so on. An escalator, power-driven stairway, and so forth. And then it goes on, an elevator does not mean any of the following: amusement ride, mining equipment, aircraft, railroad car, boat, barge, and so on, a dumbwaiter, chain bucket hoist, boiler, grate, stoker, lift, man lift, chain hoists, special purpose personal elevator, wind turbine towers, grain elevators, grain warehouses, seed processing, and so on. There's also definitions of elevator apprentice, elevator contractor, elevator inspector, an elevator mechanic, and a licensee. These are the ones that require a license under the bill, including a contractor, inspector, and mechanic. An apprentice doesn't require a license. Section 3 of the bill says that the provisions of the act shall not apply to elevators that are basically in federal buildings or under federal agency, Native American tribes, and so on, in a single-family residence adjacent to a building or structure within a manufacturing, utility, or other industrial facility, and so forth. Section 4 is nothing in the act shall be construed to preempt or otherwise restrict a city or a county from adopting or continuing any requirements or standards as long as they are equal to or more stringent than the state requirements, and they are required to notify the fire marshal on or before a date. If you work the bill, we need to change the dates in the bill, but anyway, Section 5, no individual shall erect, construct, alter, repair, and so on an elevator unless the individual is a licensed mechanic, elevator mechanic, and is working under the supervision of a licensed elevator contractor. And the same, no person shall inspect an elevator unless they have a license and so on. Section 6 establishes an 11-member elevator safety advisory board. The governor appoints 7 members. The other representatives include one from the speaker, the president, and so on. The function of this board is to advise the state fire marshal and make recommendations about rules and regulations. Section 7 on page 4 provides that if you need a license, and it establishes a fee provision of not to exceed $500 for a contractor. A mechanic is a license fee of not to exceed $150, and a inspector of a license fee of not to exceed $250, and the license is valid for a period of 2 years. There's a provision providing that in a city or county that has adopted the requirements and standards that it meet or exceed those in the act, basically can issue their own license and so on, but the license is only good within the boundaries of the city or the county. Section 8 requires liability insurance. Section 9 gives the state fire marshal the power to adopt emergency regulations and so on, may issue emergency elevator mechanics licenses if necessary in certain situations and so on. Section 10 is a procedure for where a license may be denied or revoked and so on. Section 11 establishes a provision for civil penalties for failure to abide by the act. The civil penalties can be not to exceed $1,000 per violation. Section 12 is the provision where you can request a hearing. The hearing would be under the Kansas Administrative Procedure Act. Section 14, you need a permit to construct or work an elevator. The Section 15, there's an annual inspection required. Section 16 requires people to get a certificate of operation for an elevator when they construct it, or those that are already in operation that are covered by the Act. Section 17 is on page 11. The fire marshal shall establish a registry of elevators. The section does not apply to a city or county and so on. There's that type of exception throughout the bill. Any person can, on section 18 on page 12, any person can request an investigation of an alleged violation of the Act. That request would be not subject to the Open Records Act for a period of 5 years. That's typical standard language for an exception to the open records. Section 19 requires the adoption of rules and regulations, and Section 20 establishes a elevator safety fee fund in the state treasury. If you've got questions, I'll try and answer them.
Thank you. Questions for the reviser? I would suggest, folks, online is the supplemental note from the Senate. It's easier than reading the bill, and you can see the process that the Senate went through. No questions, though. Thank you, Mike. We have some proponents. First up will be John Federico Consulting. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Federico with Federico Durst Consulting. We appear before you today in support of Senate Bill 181 on behalf of the EIWPF, the Elevator Industry Work Preservation Fund. This organization's main focus is elevator safety for both the riding public and the professionals who install and maintain elevators across the country. The EIWPF is actually a cooperative of both labor and management. And in furtherance of that alliance, you will hear from Amy Blankenbiller, who is the Executive Director of the National Elevator Industry, who is in lockstep with our client's goal of uniformity in elevator maintenance standard codes and promoting safety as its highest priority. This bill comes to you in the 2022 session, having been reviewed and debated and vetted quite thoroughly, actually. I was impressed with Chairman Alley, Chairman of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee at the time, and the amount of time that he put into reviewing the necessity and the value of this legislation. As mentioned, it ultimately passed the Senate by a vote of 32-7. I thought I might walk you through a little bit about the bill itself and leave much of the discussion of the industry to Ms. Blankenbiller. But with that, I think we should start with the main purpose of Senate Bill 181. There are three things. One is to ensure there is a statewide standard for the maintenance and inspection of elevators. Number two is to ensure everyone who installs, maintains, inspects elevators has proper training and is licensed to perform that work. And ultimately, those all lead to ensuring the safety of the riding public. What piqued our interest in taking on this issue were a couple of things. One, we were stunned actually that Kansas is one of only 2 states in the country that has not adopted a statewide safety code for elevators and escalators. Kansas currently has no requirement for inspection of commercial elevators or escalators. And Kansas has no requirement that the people who install, maintain, and repair elevators be trained or licensed. So in short, I respectfully suggest that Kansas is significantly lagging behind other states in the oversight of basic elevator safety standards. As mentioned, you'll hear from Ms. Blankenbiller, but I think it's worth mentioning how this bill was constructed ultimately, as it was quite a process. A bill was drafted actually to address this issue in 2016, but was never pursued by the interested parties. Our office set about deconstructing that bill that was, in our opinion, unnecessarily complex and burdensome. We used as a guide legislation that was crafted by the Kansas Legislature, establishing the Boiler Safety Act. I give credit to Katie Wisman, who was on staff with our firm at the time, and other members of the firm who invested an inordinate amount of time in cobbling together a bill that was more workable and more reasonable, while still achieving the goal of establishing a framework for basic elevator safety. Towards that end, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to emphasize that this bill is limited in scope from what was first considered in 2016. We took this bill and we eliminated 7 pages from that bill. We removed nearly 300 lines of text from that bill. And in pursuit of Senate Bill 81 in the 2021 legislative session, we met with over 15 different groups and entities and interested parties to try to find a compromise and put forward a bill that achieves our goals and provides the necessary safeguards that we're seeking. What's important, or as important as what's in the bill, is what's not. Again, trying to make sure this isn't overly burdensome and still works for Kansas. This bill would not include single-family dwellings. This bill would not include the inspection of grain elevators, nor would it include wind turbine towers or any conveyances that move materials instead of people. Again, some of these things were not desirable from our client, but ultimately it is the art of compromise to get a bill that the legislature would accept. Further, we tried not to preempt local control, and we spent quite a bit of time with the city of Wichita, the county of Sedgwick County, and we appreciate the folks in this building representing them and their willingness to work with them. They have a very robust elevator inspection program, and so what we didn't want to do was penalize those folks that have something in place. So in short, if you have an existing program in any community in the state that is on par with what is in this bill or more stringent, then you're exempted from the provisions of this bill. And out of fairness, we want to make sure that stays in the bill. Lastly, I've been doing this a long time. I know who we are, and there's general concern about growing government and more bureaucracy. So we try to, again, limit the scope and change the bill so that inspections are done by third-party people, qualified third-party inspectors, rather than state inspectors. And the cost should be revenue neutral for the agreed-upon fees that will be set for licensure to cover the costs of to implement and oversee this program. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time or after Ms. Blankenbiller, but I respectfully ask for consideration of passage of this bill, and I'm happy to abide by the chairman's wishes at this point.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. If it gets more involved, I'll probably have the next proponent testify. But if there are any questions for, yes, Representative, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Federico, I looked at the fiscal note and it mentions there are 3 full-time employees that would be added. Do you have any idea what those employees would be? Who would get 3 new employees if it's going to be contractual or third party?
I believe the state fire marshal, who would ultimately be involved in overseeing this program, is here. We might be a better question for him, sir. We don't think it would require 3, but we'll work through that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead, Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Federico, is there any comparable safety data? I mean, has Kansas had people die in elevators? Is there literally a public safety problem that you can quantify on this topic?
We can provide you some data. That wasn't the basis of us pursuing this. I don't want to be flippant by any means by saying we don't want to wait for some tragedy to happen to come before the legislature. What struck us was that 48 other states have figured out a way to provide just basic elevator standards and safety protocols. So I thought we might take a look at it. I'm happy to visit with folks and see if I can get some data for you.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You'll remain in just in case there's some additional testimony at some point in time. Thank you. The questions. Amy Blankenbiller, the National Elevator Industry Inc. Good morning, ma'am, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As John said, I represent the National Elevator Industry Incorporated. The acronym's NEI is how we refer to ourselves. First and foremost, NEI and its members focus on the safety issue, and Representative Wagner, I'll address your question somewhat in my comments. We represent about 85% of the work hours in the United States. Our trade association is national in scope and has most of the industry leaders as members. So there are, like I said, about 85% of the work hours that we see in both installation, maintenance, repair, service. If you look at installation and manufacturing side, our members have a higher percentage of that, and but they also do the other tasks of service and maintenance. Safety cannot be overstated as being the #1 issue, and instead of this being a reactionary approach to a tragic situation, this is more of a proactive approach, as Mr. Federico said, about bringing something to a state that has the absence of requirements. We've seen what can happen in industries that are not regulated, whether it is to industry personnel or to a member of the public, and we want to avoid something like that happening. Elevator equipment is incredibly complex. Our mechanics have to learn skilled trades and qualifications in plumbing, electrical work, carpentry, pipe fitting, welding, because all of these things go together in this incredibly complex machinery that you see, as well as using the state capitol as an example. You have an elevator from the 1920s in the cage elevator, and you have brand new equipment that was put in place during the renovations of the state capitol. And the mechanics here from its MEI Elevator Solutions, they're out of Kansas City, who do the service and maintenance, they have to be able to work on both types of equipment. So they have to have knowledge of that older equipment as well as the new state-of-the-art equipment. And that is a challenge, especially if the mechanics, their contractors and the inspectors are not familiar with the building codes, with the equipment, and they're not getting continuing education. So as we look at minimum standards, we're not trying to exceed what pretty much all trained mechanics and contractors already go through these national apprenticeship programs that exist, both union and non-union. So this is not a union bill. This is very much for all mechanics across the board. So there are multiple options that I am not in the union. I don't belong to the union, but I could buy the curriculum and I could attend and get licensed in either one of those programs if I chose to take a profession as an elevator technician. As John mentioned, Kansas is one of only 2 states. Delaware is the other state in the United States that does not have a statewide elevator program or statewide minimum standards. Kansas has over 20 building codes in place currently. They also have a myriad of licensing requirements. And really, I think more concerning to me is the fact that there are multiple jurisdictions, whether it be a county, a city, or another entity, that have no requirements at all. This poses an incredibly high safety risk for both the riding public and industry personnel, because industry personnel who go in to work on equipment have no confidence that the person who worked on it before them had the same level of training, skills, or knowledge that a more trained individual who might have gone through one of these apprenticeship programs brings to the table. So the advisory committee is an opportunity for industry personnel, industry stakeholders, the general public, to help the State Fire Marshal's office manage the regulations and technical issues associated with this industry. We have 36 advisory and actually also regulatory committees across the United States that work hand in hand with state jurisdictions to help them with their programs. These have been very successful. We have also, I said 48 states, and I do not think at this time any of them operate in a deficit. So once an elevator program is put in the state, it is self-funding. I understand the first year might be a challenge if we needed to hire in the state of Kansas. And I say we, by the way, I'm from Kansas, so I live in Topeka. So when I keep referring to we, it's because I feel like I'm as a citizen here. So anyway, if the State Fire Marshal needs to hire an individual in the first year, I'm completely confident that the program would be self-funded once they start collecting those fees for licenses, inspections, and those things. And I think the last point that I wanted to make, and then I'm happy to take any kind of questions that you have, is the industry is coming forward to ask for regulations to help us protect our individuals that work here, but also because we see this as being really important. You look at a myriad of professions in this state and across the country that all have standards, whether it's certain requirements for engineers through a college education, whether it's a welder that has to get, American Welding Society certification, and other apprenticeship programs that are in place for various professions. And when you look at the complexity of our equipment, it's a tragedy that there are not minimum standards that expect all folks working on this complex equipment to bring forward a demonstration of that knowledge and skills and ability to be able to work on it. I've been on multiple equipment. I've ridden on top of an elevator. I've seen mechanics at work, and what they bring to the table is impressive. And I do believe there's a lot of folks in the state of Kansas who bring that quality of work to the table. We want to just make sure that everyone does, so they're all safe when they go to work, and you're safe when you step on an elevator. The last statistic I wanted to let you know is that annually, elevators are ridden about 2.85 billion miles. It is the most utilized form of public transportation in the world. And to not have some minimum standards for working on it, I think, is an interesting question, and I defer to you and appeal to you to adopt a very logical and straightforward approach to something that has been put a lot of thought into making something appropriate for the state. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions if anyone has additional information that they are interested in.
Committee, questions of the conferee? Yes, Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, did I hear you correctly? You said there were 20 cities and counties in Kansas that have no regulation?
No, what I said is there's approximately 20 different building codes. So building codes are updated every 3 years. So you would have the elevator and escalator safety code. It's called A17-1 for anyone who's a
So there are 20 cities and counties that have building codes that do not regulate elevators?
No, I'm sorry. There's right now.
What are the 20 that you mentioned?
The 20 is there's 20 different editions of the code, ranging from the 1980s to more current codes that have been adopted within a county or a city across the state. There could be 30 to 50 counties that might have a minimum building code. It may not have an elevator code. So those are building codes that address all construction.
And there are a number of other jurisdictions that have nothing.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And just as an addition to that, every building that is over 1 story by the Americans with Disabilities Act is required to have an elevator. So even in the smaller, less populated counties, when you have a building above, to a 2nd story, you need to have some kind of lift.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you. Any other proponents? Anyone appearing as a proponent? I have no others listed, but if anyone appears, please stand. Seeing none, then we will go to the opponents. The next up would be Craig Jones, Country Home Elevator. He's on WebEx. Is he on WebEx? Mr. Jones, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Craig Jones. I'm the owner of Country Home Elevator and Stairlift. I am a commercially licensed elevator mechanic in Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Topeka, Wichita, Kansas City, Missouri. I have all these credentials because that's what's required of me. There are currently, our company was founded in 2000. We're based in Olathe, Kansas. Really like to thank the committee for taking the time to give me the opportunity to be heard today. Country Home Elevator has been doing business in Kansas for over 20 years. My background is in engineering, elevator design. I hold a certificate, or hold a CETS designation from the National Association of Elevator Contractors in NAEC. I have served on the executive board for NAEC, provided training to CEUs, continuing education units for elevator mechanics, elevator inspectors through NASA. It's a national organization who does elevator inspections. I have been a committee member on the A17 committee for 5.3 code committee development, so I've written elevator code and helped do code interpretations. I'm a licensed commercial elevator mechanic, and all these states, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa. I'm just trying to come before you today and talk about why one more is just not necessary for the trade. I've been in the elevator trade since 1988. I've also been a firefighter and a fire chief, so I understand public safety. I do look at it from a public safety standpoint. We are not currently in a situation where we have a public safety emergency where we're getting either mechanics or people injured in elevators. Come here to testify. Creating this act is definitely additional burden to the population. Although after reading through this, I have a few points on this. Currently, the Senate bill would allow for an unidentified code to be developed and implemented by an unregulated government official or body. So you're going to create a new regulatory agency that's going to have to come up with and develop for probably a couple years the rules that will govern this. So that's why the bill has been trimmed down, because it's not written in law. It will be written as regulatory rules. Normally, legislation is brought to front and center for some reason. I have been unable to identify that current safety hazard in this situation. There are not a substantial amount or a number of regulatory, even the previous testimony didn't have anything that said it's a current issue or a current safety hazard. I want to know if the committee has considered the budget constraints. Starting the new code authority will not just require just a few full-time employees. I think in the last Senate bill testimony, we discussed that, and even Wichita had identified that there are at least 15 people on their staff just to do the county of Wichita and Sedgwick County. Has the committee considered the added cost of small business to require permits and inspections? That's definitely a question that I would ask that you really review in depth. As the committee aware that there are currently Topeka, Kansas City, it's already being done in Topeka, Kansas City, and Wichita, and the major areas that do have code requirements. We're currently doing third-party inspections in all of the jurisdictions in the major parts of Kansas. The commercial elevator companies in Kansas are currently installing and inspecting to ASME A17, so that is the standard, and that is the standard that's being done to inspect and install equipment in the state. And most of those major jurisdictions are using that. This legislation will put small churches and not-for-profits in a difficult position to add additional expense to making their facilities AD accessibility, which is required. As it is, retaining qualified mechanics is also very, very difficult. Sorry, myself trying to get over COVID. So this legislation will add additional requirements for permitting and getting permits. That cost is not, that will be passed on to the building owners and to the state. There's currently no reciprocity within this. So even though I hold several state licenses, there's no reciprocity currently in this, and without making that part of the promulgated rules, it makes it difficult for me to just simply apply and gain another license. Much simpler process would be to register elevators, provide proof of the third-party inspection, require inspectors to be licensed and not mechanics, and just do an acceptance test. That's currently what we do with all of our commercial applications, is we do an installation and then we go out and have a third-party inspection on it. That's just my standard process. The additional regulatory body only complicates and increases the cost of building owners. Small churches already struggling to make the buildings accessible. What is the cost of owning a commercial elevator, and what will it be after this? I would ask you that you look real closely at what that permit cost is. It's not just the cost of the permit, but it's the cost of me having to have someone on staff full-time to prepare the permit and submit the permit and follow the permit and make sure that it gets done and gets approved. It's the initial acceptance test. So there's a time where we take a qualified inspector out to do the inspection. There's a cost to get that done. There will be an annual inspection. There can be 6-month inspections. Once you adopt this, then you're probably going to be adding MCP, maintenance control programs. That's a whole other additional expense that every elevator in the state of Kansas, whether it's at KU, K-State, or at the Capitol building or wherever it is going to be an additional fee or expense added to that piece of equipment. So in your fiscal notes, I would make sure that you consider the cost of that going out to each federal agency or each state agency that has equipment in it that will add additional cost of operating that elevator on an annual basis. If you adopted it in the Accept 2019 code, then you'll have video monitoring in each and every elevator within the state, and that's an additional expense that you'll have to add to every elevator that's currently in process right now. The labor rates will obviously increase because you can't have a licensed mechanic without paying him more, and don't have a problem paying my mechanics more, but it will increase my cost of doing business. There's no question about it. All I ask is that you do your due diligence and understand that the added cost of operating an elevator in Kansas and the cost of the taxpayers in Kansas is creating another bureaucracy must be funded and managed. And so that's what you will be accepting is the responsibility to manage it and set up another entity that will be required to manage and control that program. So I appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions for the conferee?
Adam Thomas.
I'm sorry. Oh, Adam Thomas, Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple quick questions, if I may. So you're licensed and do work in states that you're required to be licensed in. So I guess with 48 states requiring these licensing too, I mean, there may be costs involved, but my first question is why not Kansas? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And my second question is, if we establish a regulatory group to come up with rules and regs regarding this, I would rather them come up with these codes than the legislature, who my only expertise in elevators is writing them up and down. I would rather them do it and not us.
Understood. Understood.
Go ahead. You can respond.
Oh, my question or my answer is I have many licenses. If I could very simply do it through reciprocity, that would be great, but currently that's not in the rules or not in the regulations or the law. So reciprocity would be something I would ask you to consider putting in as a part of the law. If you're pushing forward with it, then my assumption is this is a foregone conclusion. But what I'm asking you all to consider is what the true cost of this will be to Kansas taxpayers and your constituents. That's all I ask you to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you,
Representative Arnberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. My first question is, and I'm familiar with fire sprinkler inspections, and we are licensed, the company I work for, we're licensed in Oklahoma, and it's not as extensive as you're making it sound for us to have our license. So I'm curious if you could go into detail with your Oklahoma license. You take one test and then you renew it each year. So you renew your license each year. Is that not what you have to do, or do you have to go down to Oklahoma and pay lots of fees and retest?
So the process in Oklahoma is that I have to go through an additional 10 CEUs each year of continuing education and submit that. So it's an additional 10 hours of training that each team member that has a license in Oklahoma has. Same way with Missouri, and same way with my certified elevator technician license. So it's just, again, one more process, one more application process that I have to make sure I maintain and renew. That takes time from me running and managing my business. If it were a simplified process, that would be great, but this is not a simplified process.
Okay, thank you. I see nothing wrong with continuing education. The second question I have is on your bullet point on your testimony, number 8, where it talks about qualified mechanics. It's going to be difficult to find, but in the bills on page 6, section 9, subsection B, it states an elevator contractor shall notify the state fire marshal when there is no licensed elevator mechanic, and that the state fire marshal may use a temporary elevator mechanic license.
Okay.
does that not just contradict what section B or bullet 8 is on your testimony?
So we've been doing COVID for the last 2 years, and there's no state that's declared any emergency. I think we're kind of in an emergency.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. No further questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, I was just kind of curious as to, in the conversations that you've had about this bill, is there any space in here for, if you already have these licenses, and as the Vice Chair spoke on the continuing education and things of that nature, is there a way to get a buy down for reciprocity or anything like that? Some of the fees, the inspections, if you already carry them, is there a way, have you entered into any negotiation, is my question, to find some type of way to compromise on this?
I've not been asked to be a part of any of the process.
Okay.
I'm only here because I just heard about it last week.
Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you. I would note, not really a question, I guess it's a comment. I noted that you appeared in front of the Senate as an opponent, and you identified the same concerns that they were, it was an unelected regulatory board or body, a lack of existing hazards to justify the new legislation. So basically, you're testifying to the same thing you testified in front of the Senate. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
Thank you. We're going to move along, folks. Next up will be, is it Michelle Roberts Bauer? Associated Builders and Contractors by WebEx. Is she on WebEx? Yeah. Yeah. Roberts Bauer.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. She was on earlier, but she doesn't appear to be on currently.
Okay, then I'm going to pass her. If she comes back on, let me know. Last up would be Doug Jergerson with the State Fire Marshals. Doug, good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Committee. Thank you for allowing me to appear before you today. This bill started out last session, and our office did work with the industry and all the parties involved. And we came to an agreement in the final bill that went to the Senate committee. So we've been working with the industry actually for a number of years, because a similar bill was slated to be introduced back in 2016 or 2017. We have no issues with the bill. I agree with the testimony that you've heard from others here this morning. My only concern has come up since the amendment was added to the bill excluding cities and counties, because that's the majority of the elevators and escalators in the state. And the concern of our office is if those elevators and escalators are excluded from this bill, there won't be enough revenue coming in from the elevators and escalators that are left to fund our office's responsibility and the 2 or 3 new employees that we'll need to bring on to administer this current bill. A question was asked about the fiscal note. The fiscal note's no longer accurate because of the city-county exclusion amendment. So a new fiscal note probably should be done. With that, that's basically our concern with the bill, and I just asked the committee not to move the bill forward in its current state, and I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you. Chair has one. I'm just looking back when the Senate had a hearing. The Fire Marshal's office provided neutral testimony indicating the Office of State Fire Marshal would need state general funds, and you've indicated that. So at that time you were a neutral, and now you're an opponent. What changed? Was this an amendment that was put on the floor of the Senate at some point?
That's my understanding, that city-county exclusion was done on the floor, and we weren't part of that. We weren't aware of it, and that alters drastically, I feel drastically alters our ability to administer this program because of a lack of revenue that generates.
And also, and I'm looking at the supplemental, it was indicated at that time, I believe by your office, that after 6 months in FY 2022, the Office State Elevator Safety Fund would have sufficient funding to sustain the operation, which had been the testimony prior.
That's correct. That was with all of the industry estimates there's about 10,000 elevators or escalators in the state. And based on the fee structure that's in the bill, that was going to be sufficient to fund the program in our office. But with the cities and counties now being excluded, that's probably 80 to 90% of the elevators and escalators in the state. So our office would not have that revenue to operate on.
Thank you. Next question, Dr. Epley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate your brief testimony. I just want to make sure I drill down on this. As an entity of the government, we want to make sure there's base safety for our residents. And if this bill, as I read it, is just to provide base standards for consistent uniform standards for those patrons that would use elevators, irrespective of where they are. And even with those amendments, if those standards are already met and you're only reviewing 10% or 15% or 20%, I would think that would still accomplish the focus of this bill to provide safety in that regard. As far as the cost, I'm not saying that's not important, but it's secondary to me as we look at base uniform consistent standards, and I think that's what we're all here for today. So I guess I'd like for you to help me understand that with that amendment, is that going to leave, I mean, are those radars going to fly under these standards? I don't see how they could because of the way this bill is drafted.
It's not that, and our office and myself included, we have no issue with the standards. We have no issue with the bill itself as it's written because we've been involved from the beginning with it. Again, my only concern is that with the amendment excluding the cities and counties, we won't be able to generate enough revenue to fund the program in our office. We would need some SGF money or whatever, because our office is completely fee funded. We receive no SGF funds. And so for us to hire a couple people, the initial fiscal note was 3, but one of those would just be temporary for the first year because it'll be our responsibility along with the industry to go out across the state and actually find all the elevators and escalators that are interstate and get those registered and things like that. So we initially thought that after the first year, we'd probably only need 2 positions to administer and run the program. But again, that was counting on all those 10,000 units in the state and not the cities and counties being excluded from the bill.
Just if I may follow. So in that hypothetical situation, if that's the case, would it be that we would only need 1 FTE rather than 2 if we're only doing that percentage of elevators, and would that therefore diminish the dependence on the SGF?
I'm actually not sure because this is all new, and it would also depend on the advisory committee and what rules and regulations the advisory committee recommends. Because depending on the rules and regulations that are put into place, that could also increase costs or it could decrease costs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. But as far as the cities and the counties exempting out, only if those standards are at this level. If there are less, you would still be involved in those. So when you say you're exempting all the cities and counties that have a requirement, but if it doesn't come up to the standards that are in this bill, then you would still be involved.
We would still be involved.
And that's the unknown.
That is, and the other thing is that the revenue side of it, we were relying on all the individual registrations of those units.
Right.
So if the city or counties already have plans or policies in place, and those facilities are already registering their elevators and escalators in the city and getting their permits from the city, they would be excluded from doing the same with the state. And that is the majority of the revenue for this program comes from the actual annual registrations of the different elevators and escalators across the state.
And the other unknown is if you're doing less elevators, then you may not need 3 people or 2.5.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Folks, we're going to move right along. I've got 3 more conferees.
Oh, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Michelle is online on WebEx right now.
Okay. Michelle, are you on WebEx?
Yes,
Hello?
sir. Can you hear me?
Okay, you can go forward. Please try to keep it brief. We're running out of time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to speak to a couple of things that I think would be potentially clarified in the rules and regulations. But one of the things that would be incredibly, I guess, first, my apologies. Michelle Roberts Bauer. I represent Associated Builders and Contractors, Heart of America chapter. We represent construction and construction-related firms across Kansas and Missouri, primarily in the commercial sector, and I am a registered lobbyist with the state of Kansas. We think that grandfathering would be a very important element to include to ensure that individuals that have been making a career in this industry are not disconnected. That could be an undue burden. And so that is something that we would really like to see outlined, and perhaps that comes in the rules and regulations, but I think it's important to note. The other thing that I have some concerns with is allowing the local jurisdictions to opt to have different standards. If we're looking at a statewide standard, we would prefer that a contractor and an individual be able to get one license and work throughout the state, because the functioning of an elevator does not change with county lines, and it would be unfortunate for an individual to finish up one project and be unable to work on the next project simply because it's in a different jurisdiction and their license wasn't current in that jurisdiction. We've seen that lead to some unnecessary and unwelcome burdens for individuals earning a career in the industry in other areas. That would be my biggest point of concern, is allowing for one statewide license to serve the entirety of the state for our individuals.
Thank you. Questions for the conferee? Seeing no questions, thank you very much for appearing today.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other opponents? No other ones appearing. I have no other listing. We'll go to the neutrals. Randy, if you would be so kind. Again, I would ask to hit the high points and so we can move on.
Very good, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Randy Stuckey this morning on behalf of the Kansas Grain and Feed Association, that's the grain elevators in the state of Kansas, and Remy Kansas Biofuels, that's the biofuel processing facilities in the state of Kansas. So thank you to the proponents that worked with us, and specifically and intentionally exempting our industries, the lifts at our facilities, from this bill. We were opponents in previous editions of this bill in recent years. We stood neutral in the bill in the Senate for the reason that we were exempt. And my purpose this morning, I don't like to appear as a neutral party, a conferee if I don't need to, but I did think it was important this morning to get on the record before the committee. Please look at my written testimony to explain exactly why we were specifically and intentionally broadly in the agribusiness industry. That's the grain elevators, feed mills, seed mills, and biofuel processing centers. The lifts within our facilities were, again, specifically and intentionally exempted from this bill because we are regulated, and there's like a 7-point run of the ways in which we are already specifically regulated by the insurance companies under OSHA, a local emphasis program on our industry, the OSHA standard to which we are both regulated and inspected. Also, our insurance companies require biannual inspections to the industry standard that's been mentioned a couple of times this morning. Suffice to say that we want to make sure that we remain as an exempt party to this bill should it go forward. and that in years down the road, if they look back on this hearing, they'll say, why were they exempted for this very reason? So that's why we stand neutral this morning on the bill, and certainly stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. You always do a great job.
Thank you, Chairman.
Questions of Randy as a neutral? No. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, be John Goodyear. John, come on up with the League of Municipalities, Kansas League. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, good morning. I will, for the large part, let my testimony stand on its own, but some things just to hit the highlights. As Mr. Federico mentioned in his testimony, for the longest time, still, the state hasn't had a minimum standard. Cities, in recognition of that and in recognition of their responsibility to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens, filled that vacuum, adopted standards, and why we are neutral on the bill, we don't have a statement of, on this in our statement of municipal policy, we don't have a statement on elevator safety, but we always support measures that protect and preserve home rule. So here, we appreciate those provisions in those bill. We appreciate the work by the proponent conferees to recognize that some cities, some counties have adopted some pretty extensive standards, and we appreciate the protection of those standards and the allowance that those will continue to be in place if this bill becomes law. And Mr. Chairman, we would just ask that if the committee moves forward with this bill, that those sections of the bill be preserved. And I can stand for any questions.
Thank you. Questions for the League? Again, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there other neutrals appearing here today? Seeing none. Committee, is there any questions of any of the conferee that is still in the room? Yes, go ahead. Representative Garber. Identify who you would like to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question for the conferees, but I would like some information from research.
Okay.
The estimated number of elevators, lifts, human moving devices, whatever we've got in this bill, are in the state. Number of accidents involving human fatalities and just harm or injury. And I would like you to reach out to other states that have these laws in place and see what you can find there as far as these two questions.
Okay. They will.
Thank you,
that.
Mr. Chairman.
And of course, share that with the entire committee. Share it with the entire committee. Thank you. Then I see no other neutrals, and I will close the hearing on Senate Bill 181. Tomorrow, folks, we're going to do the constitutional amendment. You were all sent out copies of the minutes from our last meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve. Madam?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the minutes from 1/11/2022.
Do I have a second with Representative Epley? Further discussion? Seeing none. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Ayes have it. The minutes are approved. We're going to try to keep up with our minutes on a weekly basis. Of course, Connie does many things, and when I said that, she smiled at me. So I said we will attempt, only attempt, to get those done. Tomorrow we have another hearing. You'll get the agenda for next week today. And anything else for the good of the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.